How do you do, folks? Got another Bladeslinger vlog for you, and the topic of today is remakes, remasters, and reboots. The three R's of reintroducing a game series. I've had this on the brain lately because of the Silent Hill 2 remake that's supposed to be due out here soon, and listening to people talk about it, I've heard people use all these phrases interchangeably. I've heard some people call it a remaster. I've heard some people call it a remake. I've heard some people call it a reboot. And it's like, this is something that has always annoyed me a little bit when it comes to video games, because this is just one of the easiest things to understand, yet people still view it all as sort of a muddy term in the gaming industry. So I thought I'd just go ahead, clarify what the three R's are, and also talk about when it's appropriate to do a remaster versus a remake, or vice versa with any of the three R's. So we're going to be talking about remasters, remakes, and reboots. To start things off, we're going to talk about remasters. So what a remaster is when you take an already existing game and you essentially port it up to new hardware, taking advantage of the new hardware to, just make the game just a little bit better, to take advantage of, the jump in hardware capabilities. Some typical things you see in a remaster are cleaner visuals, a better frame rate, maybe a little bit of added content. But for the most part, these games are still the same as their original version, just made a little bit better with the new technology that's on hand. A good example, I would say, is Epic Mickey Rebrushed, which I've heard some people refer to as a remake, but it's really not. If you played the game, it is still, in essence, the Wii game. All the level designs the same, the cut designs are the same. It all just looks nicer and it plays a lot better now that it doesn't have the funky controls of the Wii version, as well as the hardware limitations that it had. In general, I don't think that remasters are a bad thing, and it's a practice that has been around for a long time. Some early examples I can think of would be Super Mario Superstars on the SNES, or Sonic Jam on the Sega Saturn, but where it really became popular was during the era of the PlayStation 3, and part of the reason for that was PlayStation 3 wasn't backwards compatible. Unlike the Wii and Xbox 360, you couldn't play your PlayStation 2 games on the PlayStation 3, which meant that if you were jumping into the PlayStation 3 expecting to be able to play all the PlayStation 2 games as well as the new games on PlayStation 3, you would be sorely mistaken. To sort of combat this, Sony started rolling out HD collections of all the classic games that were on the PlayStation 2. So you got Sly Cooper, God of War, Jak and Daxter, Ratchet and Clank, and many others. And this made for good business. While these probably weren't the biggest of sellers, they were still something that people bought because either you wanted to play a better version of these already great games, or you were a new player who was playing them for the first time. I remember getting my PlayStation 3 for the first time. That was my first console ever, and just being so happy when they released the Sly collection on there, just because those were the games that I always envied being on the PlayStation 2 while I was limited to the GameCube. So that was a good call on their part, and it would become even more prevalent in the following generation of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, because initially neither of those consoles were backwards compatible. However, recently remasters have sort of developed a negative reputation, and that's primarily because they aren't as necessary as they once were. So I've heard a lot of people complain about, the remaster or remake. I haven't played the game, so I can't really say what it is at this point, of The Last of Us Part 1. The fact that they plan on remastering The Last of Us Part 2, evidently. and the remaster of Until Dawn. A lot of people say it's silly to remaster those games simply because if you want to play those games on your PS5, you can. You just, put your PS4 game in the PS5 and bam, there you go. A lot of people are saying that they should just, patch a PS5 upgrade in there, kind of like what they were doing with the cross-console games that you had when the PlayStation 5 first launched. But for whatever reason, it seems that Sony intends on making these full-blown re-releases at $60 and everything, which I don't think is going to go over very well because it's kind of hard to sell games like that when you can get the originals and still play them on the same console for just so much cheaper. And I don't understand why they feel the need to remaster those games, because there's still plenty of games on the PlayStation 3 that still haven't gotten ported up to the new console. How about a Resistance collection? How about an Infamous collection? Why are you wasting time with Until Dawn and The Last of Us remasters? I mean, come on, Sony. I actually have to give full props to Xbox here because they have the right idea. I don't know if you've ever played an Xbox 360 version on your Xbox Series S or X or whatever you have, but when you do that, you'll actually find that the performance improves a little bit. The picture is cleaner, the frame rate is better, and yeah, they actually have a sort of remaster function built into the console, which, yeah, that's what you should be doing. They're not offering a $700 upgraded console because they don't need to. So yeah, Microsoft actually got something right. It's just a shame that you can play just about everything they have on another console. And of course, Nintendo re-releasing a lot of the old Wii U games as well as other games in their catalog on Nintendo Switch. Good for business, and their console isn't backwards compatible with anything, so they get a pass here. But that's what a remaster is. It's just a game that is ported up to new console. No real changes made to it. Like, you can even see it with Rebush right here. You can call it a remake if you want, but those are the exact same cutscenes from the previous game. Now, that's not to say that a remaster can't be bad. I already mentioned that you want to make sure that, you're remastering the right games. Some games just don't need it, but if you're going to remaster a game, you also want to make sure you do it right as well. I can think of a few remasters that just weren't anywhere near as good as they should have been, and are actually worse off on the new hardware than they should be. And the best example I can think of is actually the Silent Hill 2 remaster. So, a lot was working against this version of the game to begin with. For starters, Silent Hill 2 is lost media, so they cannot release the game in its original form anymore, which is why I hope that the remake is so good, because I want this game to reach a new generation. But because of that, Konami tried to port the game up using a prototype build that they had lying around. But unfortunately, they just didn't put the money into it to bring it up to snuff with the rest of the series, and I think the results are pretty evident here. The PS3 version of Silent Hill 2 is just absolutely awful, dude. And recently, some bad remasters have become very common, like the Grand Theft Auto Definitive Edition, the reforged version of, Warcraft, and Sonic Colors, Sonic Colors Ultimate, is that what it was called? I pray to Lifestone Sega isn't about to screw up Sonic Generations either, because that's one of their few bright spots right now, but yeah, if you're going to remaster a game, don't half-ass the process, do it right. You have a chance to squeeze more money out of an already great game, just spend a little more money on it, that's all you really have to do. So, moving into the realms of remakes, what a remake is it's similar to a remaster in that you take a pre-existing game and you move it to new console, whereas with a remaster, you're basically leaving the game as is. With a remake, you're essentially making something completely new, just using the original game as a basis. The best example I can think of is, of course, the Resident Evil 2 remake. I mean, looking at these two games side by side, Even though you can notice similar iconography, the level design is similar and all that stuff, uh, like, the difference between them is just night and day. And there are a lot of benefits to doing a remake like this. The main thing being that if a game just hasn't held up very well, you have a chance to introduce new gameplay mechanics that will just make it go over better with the general audience. So the Resident Evil 2 remake, it includes over-the-shoulder aiming, a full 3D camera, smooth analog controls, which definitely makes it more appealing than the clunky tank controls and fixed camera angles of the original game. The presentation is better. It made some slight adjustments to the story to make it flow a little bit better. In general, it is just a marked improvement over the first game. Now, it's not to say that the original isn't worth playing. It's still a very good game, but the remake is simply better. It just has all of the polish that you would want a game as good as Resident Evil 2 to have, just, brought up to snuff with modern game sensibilities. So when is it good to do a remake versus a remaster? Well, for starters, if the game has held up just fine, it's better to just do a remaster than try to change what's already there. But it's also important to make sure that enough time has passed to where doing a remake would be worthwhile. It made sense to do the Resident Evil 2 remake because Resident Evil 2 is one of the more popular games in the series, and it had been 20 years since the original had come out. And with the survival horror genre sort of on the upswing at the time, it just made perfect business sense to do that remake. And to this day, the Resident Evil remake is still my benchmark for what a good survival horror game is. So that time difference is a key factor here, and if you do the remake too soon, that can have some dire consequences. Even the Dead Space remake, which there was only a, I think, 10-year gap between those games, the difference there, it's not as substantial as the Resident Evil 2 remake. While the Dead Space remake is by no means bad, I still think it's the definitive way to play Dead Space. I also wouldn't say that you'd be missing anything if you chose to pass on the remake and just play the original because you didn't have the money for it at the time. And I played the original Dead Space right before I played the remake, and it honestly felt a little redundant. So while still a great game, it just wasn't worth remaking in the first place. I think they should have waited another 5 years and maybe another generation before they tackled that. Another thing that you shouldn't be doing is you shouldn't be remaking games if the original is still widely available. Resident Evil 4, when I heard they were doing a remake of the game, I was just kind of rolling my eyes at it. And the main reason for that is I didn't see the point. For starters, Resident Evil 4 just holds up extremely well, and anyone who says it hasn't aged that well has probably never played more than the first 5 minutes of it. They probably get the tank controls and probably say it's clunky, but they don't realize that everything in the game is designed around the clunky controls. And once you get used to it, you're in for one of the best third-person shooters ever. But then the remake comes out, and you find that they tamper with a lot of that stuff, but that's a story for another day. With the Resident Evil 4 remake, what I'm trying to say is they shouldn't have remade this one because not only does the game still hold up, but it's also widely available. I own 3 different versions of Resident Evil on 3 different consoles, and that's not even scratching the surface of all the available versions of this game are. If I want to play Resident Evil 4, I'll play Resident Evil 4. With something like Resident Evil 2, it's a little harder to play that because at the time the only available version was on the PSN. So again, it made sense to do that remake, and that was also a reason why the Dead Space remake wasn't as necessary, because the original Dead Space was still widely available. There was just no reason to make Resident Evil 4. It was not begging for a remake. And also, if you are going to do a remake, if you must do a remake for a pre-existing game, I beg of you, and this goes for remasters as well, if the original version is still widely available, do not delist the original version. Now, a lot of studios will give you some corporate bullshit about, oh, we just want to make sure that any new players are getting the definitive version of this game. Like, there's no reason for them to end up with the original version. No, gamers are not freaking stupid. What that is going to say to us is that you are not confident in this remake, and you also want to maximize sales, so you're going to take the original off the market so people don't buy that instead. I mean, like, come on, what do you take us for, guys? I was really happy that Capcom did not do that, and you know what? EA didn't do that with Dead Space either. It's funny to think that those two companies, made the smart choice not to delist their original games. But then you have companies like Blizzard, Activision, Sega doing that. Like, come on, guys, use your head. And that brings us finally to the topic of reboots. And what a reboot is, it's basically where you have a new game in a series, but rather than remaking it, you're essentially just starting from scratch. The main reason people do reboots is for two reasons. For starters, it's because the series has just kind of stalled. Star Fox is a good example of this. After Star Fox Assault came Star Fox Command, and I don't know if you guys have ever played that game, but it was just a narrative nightmare, that game. Like, the tone was just a mess. No one just had any idea where the story was going to go from there. And apparently Nintendo didn't know where it was going to go either. So rather than pick up from there, they decided to just reboot the franchise, which is why we eventually got Star Fox Zero instead of a sequel to Command. Now, part of the reason reboots are frowned upon is because people do get attached to stories in video games. I know a lot of people say story doesn't matter in video games or what have you, and that's a topic for another day. But because of that, people don't want to see storylines abandoned if they're really attached to it. But sometimes it just made sense to do so, as was the case with Star Fox Command. Another reason you'd want to do a reboot is if it had just been a long time since the previous game. Some people have said that it would have been better if Star Fox Zero had just picked up where Star Fox Assault had left off, ignore Command. But it had been well over a decade since Assault had come out, so it wasn't fresh in anyone's mind. Again, it just kind of made sense to do a reboot. And that can breathe new life into a franchise. I wouldn't say that's what happened with Star Fox Zero. That game actually had a lot of issues with it, and I think there's a reason Nintendo hasn't put it on the Switch yet. But for a better example, let's go to the Tomb Raider reboots, released in 2013, I want to say. So, despite the fact that the Tomb Raider series was very groundbreaking in regards to 3D platformers, the games just haven't held up very well. And when you get to the newer games, on PlayStation 2 and Xbox, while they are better, they still weren't really innovating in any meaningful capacity, and that's primarily because, the team behind them was just forced to make them year after year for a good long while. And once sales dropped, they decided, yeah, it was time for something new. So a few years goes by, and the reboot comes out. And while a lot of people detest the reboot because, they just take the game at face value and assume all it is just Uncharted, but now you're playing as a babe. Which is funny because when Uncharted was making the rounds, they referred to it as Dude Raider. It was just Tomb Raider where you're playing as a dude instead of a woman. But, they actually add a lot to the reboots. While, yeah, they definitely were taking cues from newer games like Uncharted with the cover-based shooting and the platforming, they were also doing some new things too. They experimented with more exploration rewards with the tombs and everything, and just made for a deeper combat experience. There was a lot going on with the Tomb Raider reboot. It's a lot better than a lot of people would say it is. Honestly, this was one of my favorite games of the year when it comes out, and whenever I say someone needs to give Tomb Raider a try, I usually suggest this over the original games. And part of the reason for that is while the game it is different from the original, it still has the spirit of the original Tomb Raider. It is still about adventure and all that stuff, but at the same time, it's also doing something different from the original series. It's obviously a lot grittier than the original series, but it also mixes up Laura's character a little bit, emphasizing the survivalist aspect of the character, which I thought was a good idea. It makes her just a little bit more interesting than, like how, Nathan Drake, whose personality is very similar to Lara Croft's personality in the original games. The thing about reboots is that you don't necessarily have to go all the way with it. I remember when Resident Evil 7 came out, a lot of people mistook it for a reboot as well, and for good reason. For starters, they were sort of iffy with the title. Some people said it was called Resident Evil 7, some people said it was just Resident Evil Biohazard. And you would see previews for the game, and it seemed like there was no connection to anything that was happening in the previous game. So a lot of people took it at face value as a remake, but then they actually played, not remake, a reboot, but then they actually played it, and while it was essentially doing its own thing, you did find that there was a connection to it. So, yeah, that's what you call a soft reboot. That's where you're still kind of breaking with what came before, but at the same time, you're still connecting it to the greatest story of what came before. And that can be beneficial as well because it can introduce new players to the old games while also still giving them a refreshing experience, which is why games like Resident Evil 7, Donkey Kong Country Returns, Doom 4, I refuse to call it Doom 2016, I know it's a reboot, but so is Doom 3, and the Tomb Raider reboots have done so well. But reboots are also something you have to be very careful with because if you break too much with what came before, then there's a chance that the fan base is going to turn against you. And to illustrate that, you need to look no further than DMC Devil May Cry, the attempted reboot to the Devil May Cry series. Going back to Epic Mickey for a second, in regards to the leaked concept art for that game, Warren Spector said that the reason that concept art was so demented and twisted was because he was looking at it as a means to figure out where the line was. He had his illustrators go that far because he wanted to see what Disney would be okay with, because he understood that this was a collaboration and that he was conscious of the fact that Disney was very protective of their image, so he wanted to make sure that he respected that while also being able to do his own thing. And he felt that the best way to do that was to cross the line, so he went very extreme with that original design of the game. And then when Disney said, no, this is too much, he dialed it back. It's just why, even though Epic Mickey has a very unique vibe to it for a Disney game, it still doesn't seem out of place in their catalog. So what happened with the Devil May Cry remake is that they went over the line, and then when they showed that to Capcom, they just kind of shrugged and said, go ahead. And they just really should have stopped them, because what's worse than a studio telling you that you've crossed the line with your different approach to the game? It's when the fans tell you that you've crossed the line. From day one, people just hated everything about how the reboot worked. And even though I feel like DMC is a lot better gameplay-wise than people give it credit for, it just doesn't matter, because no matter what, fans are going to hate it. And it didn't help that the game was also somewhat disrespectful to the original series as well, which if you're doing a reboot, a remake, or a remaster, you really shouldn't do, because you are taking so much from it. Like the wig bit especially rubbed people the wrong way in DMC, and the reason for that is it didn't come as tongue-in-cheek It just came off as them being tone deaf to the fact that people didn't like this new approach. Like, in a lot of the early Marvel movies, you had scenes where characters would make fun of the costumes the characters would wear in their original series, but that came off as tongue-in-cheek because the way the characters were designed and the general vibe of the MCU, people accepted it. People didn't accept DMC, and for good reason. It's just too different to appeal to the fan base that was already there, and it was just such a massive failure that Capcom actually went back to the original continuity, which is something you don't see a whole lot in video games. It's the only time I can think of where they attempted to reboot something, but when it didn't work, they just went back to doing numbered sequels in the original continuity. And it ended up being for the best because Devil May Cry 5 is just much, much better than DMC. And it goes beyond the fact that, Dante doesn't look like a tool anymore. So yeah, that's the difference between a remake, remaster, and reboot. So I think now the question is, with Silent Hill 2 coming out, did they make the right call remaking the game instead of remastering or rebooting it? So first of all, yes, they made the right call not remastering the original game. Outside of the fact that they already tried to do it and failed epically, mostly because, again, they lost the source code, the original Silent Hill 2 doesn't hold up from a gameplay perspective. I've always said that Silent Hill 2 is a game that is good despite its gameplay, not because of it. Like, the controls are sloppy, the camera is frustrating, the combat is unsatisfying, and it honestly doesn't work that well as a survival horror game when you really think about it. But the story, the atmosphere, the characters, the symbolism, like, it's all just so good that you're able to overlook those flaws. It's one of the few instances where I can say a game isn't that much fun to play, but I would still recommend that people play the hell out of it. So, yeah, it was definitely due for a remake, as opposed to a remaster. But a lot of people might ask, well, wouldn't it make more sense to do a reboot of the series? Well, here's the thing about doing a remake of Silent Hill 2. If you do a remake of Silent Hill 2, you actually have a chance to reboot the series, do a soft reboot of it. And the reason I say that is because Silent Hill 2 operates in isolation compared to the rest of the series. While it takes place in the same town as Silent Hill, and, that's why all this crazy stuff is going on, the game doesn't go into that. What Silent Hill 2 is not about is the town. What it is about is the story of James Sunderland. It's about the personal horror, and that was really well received when it came out. But when it came time to do Silent Hill 3, Konami, for whatever reason, wanted to go back to the story of the first game, so it essentially dropped the personal horror and just went back to occults, bizarre gods and everything, and it just didn't work anymore. It just didn't work. And that's probably why Silent Hill ended up going by the wayside, because it just moved away from what people came to really love about the series. So by doing a remake of Silent Hill 2, they have a chance to start from scratch and go back to the personal horror. So you start with Silent Hill 2, introduce people to, that whole concept. And then from there, you can start making original games, just having different characters with different issues enter Silent Hill and just seeing what kind of world it creates for them, what kind of personal horror it creates. So, in a sense, they are still rebooting the franchise, and if it does well, I pray to God it does well, we might get more Silent Hill. While I am still disappointed that Silent Hills got canceled because I wanted to see what Kojima and Guillermo del Toro would have done with it, I still think there is a chance that this remake of Silent Hill 2 will do good things for the series, but only time will tell. I'll let you guys know what I think about the remake when I finally get a chance to play it. But until then, I'll see you guys next time.